things change in the short run, and what we want to establish now is that the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Economists have come up with a number of reasons why the short run aggregate supply curve might be upward sloping, and I want to look at three broad categories of explanations that have been used. The first one is sticky wage theory, that the wages of workers don't adjust very quickly to rising prices or rising output, don't adjust very quickly to changes in the long run aggregate supply curve or aggregate demand. The second one is that the price of output doesn't adjust very quickly, that manufacturers don't change their prices as fast as changes in aggregate demand or long-run aggregate supply. And then finally, a misperceptions theory, that the actors in the economy don't always know what the price level is and make their decisions based on incomplete information. The thing to note is that all of these theories about why the short-run aggregate supply curve is different from the long-run aggregate supply curve comes from some sort of deviation from equilibrium prices. If the price level were to adjust perfectly and instantaneously to changes in aggregate demand or changes in long-run aggregate supply, then we wouldn't have an upward-sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Economists express fluctuations as with the following equation, that output, or GDP in an economy, is equal to this natural rate of output plus some fraction of the difference between actual prices and expected prices. So if actual prices are too high, if actual prices are higher than expected, output will tend to be somewhat too large, will be too high, as firms increase their output in response to the higher prices, more than perhaps would occur in equilibrium. If actual prices are too low, then firms cut output back too far. As prices move back in line with expectations, output will return towards the natural rate of output. So differences in output, fluctuations around the natural rate of output, depend on differences between the actual price level and the expected price level. And when actual prices match long-run equilibrium prices, then output will approach the natural rate of output. One explanation for why the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward is what we call sticky wage theory, as we mentioned before. It's important to remember that behind the aggregate supply and aggregate demand diagram is a market where workers determine how much they work and firms determine how much they wish to hire. And workers will work more at higher real wages. If I get paid more for my labor, I'm willing to supply more of it. Meanwhile, firms will hire more workers at lower real wages. If firms can hire workers at a low wage relative to the price of their output, they will want to hire more workers. And in equilibrium, the real wage for workers matches the real wage for firms in equilibrium, at the equilibrium level of employment. Under sticky wage theory, there's an observation that nominal wages are slow to adjust. If prices rise, but wages don't rise, then essentially firms will want to hire more workers than workers would be willing to supply. And if prices fall, then firms will want to reduce the level of employment more than workers will want to reduce their labor supply. When a price of a firm's output rises, then they hire more workers whose wages don't reflect the higher prices, and eventually the falling real wage will reduce the supply of workers, but this takes time. Additionally, when the price of a firm's output falls, we note they hire fewer workers, and eventually there will be workers who will be willing to work at some new lower wage. This surplus of workers will reduce the prevailing wage in equilibrium, but this takes time as well. So it takes time for workers and firms to adjust in the labor market to the new reality of higher or lower prices, and that's what the issue of sticky wage theory says. Two other reasons why the short-run aggregate supply curve might slope upward are sticky price theory and misperceptions theory. Under sticky price theory, when prices change, when the price level changes overall, some firms don't necessarily recognize it as quickly as other firms, and so some firms might wind up with higher published prices than they ought to be. If I don't change my prices very often, if I have long-term contracts or something like that, and have established price levels with some of my customers, a change in the price level might lead my customers to switch to other suppliers, and so I wind up selling less than I would have otherwise. Under misperceptions theory, a drop in the price level might be perceived by me as a drop in this particular market, and so I respond to the change in demand for my particular good or service by reducing my output, even if reducing the price I charge might be more efficient and more consistent with the new equilibrium level of aggregate demand. When economists consider all of these different explanations, it's probably the case that each of these theories contains some component of the truth. These are not mutually exclusive stories. What's consistent across all of these is that expectations matter. What's very important is in terms of explaining the upward sloping aggregate supply curve, is that when we have differences in expectations between the expected price and the actual price, then we get outcomes that are not consistent with the long-run equilibrium level of output or long-run equilibrium level of unemployment. These expectations play an important role. So, for instance, if we get 3% inflation, if we expect 3% inflation and obtain 2% actual inflation, we may have workers who contracted and firms who contracted with them based on this expectation of a high rate of inflation. When prices only go up by 2%, then firms hire fewer workers. They lay workers off at these high prices or work people for fewer hours or something like that. When prices only go up by a small amount, they find their workers to be too expensive and reduce their use of labor. And so what's important here is the difference between expected inflation and actual inflation. If wages were allowed to adjust, if wages only went up by 2%, then we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. But the difference between the expected inflation, where we sign, for instance, labor contracts, and the actual inflation leads to workers being overpaid relative to the price level in the short run. In the long run, of course, workers can sign new contracts.